Hey kids, just a little PSA before we get to the many bumbles and fumbles of Cross Tekken. If you're like me, and I know I am, you enjoy bashing buttons to take out evil end bosses and their many minions, so I cordially invite you to check out The Takeover. It's a 90s era beat 'em up that I spent the last 4 years producing. It's been out on Steam for a few months and just launched on the Nintendo Switch, with a PS4 version coming later this summer. There's 4 playable characters, multiple endings, unlockables, and a banging soundtrack from Little V Mills and the legend himself, Yuzo Koshiro. It's been a passion project for a long time now, and it's really exciting for me to finally see it available. If you want to know more, check out the video in the description for details on future versions and a physical release. And now, on to Mr. Ono's wild and wacky ride. Hello and welcome to another face-busting, tag-teaming, money-losing episode of What Happened, the show that asks you, will you cross the line? Into finding out just what went down, up, and wrong all over with Capcom's infamous Street Fighter Cross Tekken. Now, this is an episode that's been years in the making, so make sure you've properly stretched and have all your gems set and ready to go. Okay, 20%. Attack. Oh, wait, no, times 5, no. Cause this story's about to get downright fierce. So like many of our previous jaunts through Capcom's Hall of Shame, there's not exactly a whole lot of inside information from the front lines. It's a secretive company that more often than not is rarely plagued by problems during actual development. Very few of their in-house games run into engine trouble or some other type of technical issue. What does happen, however, is a breakdown between the developmental and marketing teams, along with the bosses at the top. It's why we have misfires like DMC, Dead Rising 4, Bionic Commando, and all the rest. Fortunately, I was lucky enough to speak to a former staff member at Capcom USA who was right in the trenches during Cross Tekken's launch, narrowly dodging fireballs, timeout victories, and disastrous marketing gimmicks. We'll be checking in with them often. It all starts, of course, with Street Fighter 4. Now, it was a huge risk making this game, which took Yoshinori Ono months, if not years, to get greenlit from those aforementioned bosses at the top. Fighting games, despite some gems, God, I gotta watch it with all the gem references, was certainly a genre that was in a sort of dormant phase, worlds away from the sonic boom period of the 90s. So the fact that Street Fighter 4 was such a huge success in both the arcades and especially the home consoles was a big win for Capcom and just about everybody else. It absolutely pushed other publishers to start developing their own fighters once again, but no one was quicker to capitalize than Capcom themselves. The company, now happy or confident or maybe overconfident, decided to start greenlighting a bunch of other button bashers, which kinda made sense. Throughout the 90s and even the early 2000s, they had about 34 different fighting franchises all going on at the same time. Since the 90s, however, many other genres experienced their own boom periods, so there was more competition than ever before. Capcom wasted no time and began dropping hints about a new fighting game in early 2010, with many people expecting a new Darkstalkers. No. I just reminded myself, But what no one expected was at that year's San Diego Comic-Con, where Katsuhiro Harada, patriarch of the Tekken clan, crashed a panel held by Ono, and suddenly announced Street Fighter Cross Tekken. People were caught off guard in the best possible way. While initially seen as a bit of an odd pairing, it was nevertheless pretty damn hyped to see two universes, cross over. Now, this was clearly a deal whose inception started in Japan, so when Capcom USA was let in on the secret, they were of course blown away, but there were some concerns. While it wasn't the exact crossover most of us would have imagined coming about, it was still seen as a fresh and exciting concept, especially considering there was going to be the Tekken version. How Tekken characters would play in a Street Fighter game was definitely a question, but we were riding high off the reviving of the fighting game genre just 2 years earlier. That said, there were some reservations that came about, which in hindsight were the cracks that would soon form. The main one was the insane initial sales forecast, which basically added together the user bases for Street Fighter and Tekken at the time, not considering that A, there may be some overlap, and B, there are a bunch of 09ers who weren't going to switch over from Street Fighter 4. So yes, maybe with egos slightly inflated and expectations a tad too high, Cross Tekken was pegged to be a big seller by Capcom, but why wouldn't it be? Their flagship fighter was doing well, Tekken had just launched their first game on then-current consoles, so this was going to be a slam dunk, a dragon punch, or an electric wind god fist. Right? Well, very quickly, money started to get spent, and not all of it smartly. Capcom contracted out another company to animate shitloads of CGI videos, maybe more than they needed. Instead of simply relying on their in-game musicians, they splurged on licensed music that also maybe wasn't needed.
When the sun goes down, the stars come out.
It's 470,000, sir.
Yeah?
Finally, Namco obviously would need to see some money back in exchange for the usage of their characters, so Capcom's fat stacks were quickly getting less fat. So, because of all these factors, right off the bat, this left Cross Tekken in a sort of pit that was ever so slightly getting deeper and deeper, but it had to crawl out of to reach profitability. The former staff member I spoke to explains. The budget versus forecast was done in a way that was the opposite of how it should go. Every time the budget would increase, which would be quite a bit due to common game design bloat and things like the Polygon Pictures trailers, the forecast would need to increase to match it, without anything being added that would get us to that forecast. So we found ourselves on the marketing side having to sell more copies of the game without additional tools in which to do so, which, as you can imagine, was difficult. Maybe knowing this would become an issue, Capcom decided they would need to take steps to combat the problem head on, and to do so, they would need to increase their attack by 30% without sacrificing their speed. Gems were instituted as a way to offset all these costs. It was something that was interwoven into the game's design from a very early point, even before Capcom USA was told of the crossover's existence. Just as a reminder for those that are fortunate enough to not know or have forgotten, if you bought the special edition of the game, you got an additional 45 gems, which is almost the amount that came with the base package. And as a follow-up to that 1-2 combo, each brick and mortar store also had their own exclusive packs of gems, with almost all of them being better than those shit level 1 versions for loser idiots. I mean, even PlayStation Home was offering its own gem pack. Wait, what was PlayStation Home again? I legit forget. Oh my god, PlayStation Home! Out of all the egregious DLC practices Capcom was dipping their dick into during these trying years, the gem system was often seen as the most ill-conceived and transparently greedy of them all. And in a damned if you do, damned if you don't type moment, players could go gemless if they wished, which was good, because selecting them brought the pace of tournaments to a grinding halt and were eventually banned from most majors. Because of this though, gem DLC sales were exceedingly low because they simply boiled down to pay-to-win mechanics, which many people tend to hate a whole bunch. So they didn't quite become the cost-offsetting mechanic they were designed to be, which wasn't great for Cross Tekken's long-term goals, because initially, gems were meant to go on for years and years and years. One of the concepts was that the gem system would become so robust that you would ostensibly have an infinite amount of fighter variations. There were ideas for very powerful gems down the line that would basically turn one character into a completely different one. They were thinking that each average player would spend $12 on gems in total, which was aggressive at the best of times, so I think it goes without saying they did not hit those numbers, and because of that, there was gem DLC for only a few months until it was quietly cancelled. Even before launch, the initial reaction to Gems wasn't exactly a fan favorite, but it was only the first in a long list of things that fans were very much not favoriting. Street Fighter IV on the Xbox 360 and PS3 were essentially the same game, but things suddenly changed when Capcom revealed in January of 2012 that the PlayStation 3 version would receive 5 exclusive characters, all of which would be immediately banned in all tournaments. This motley crew of combatants included 2 cats who were PlayStation mascots in Japan, the dude from Infamous, I don't remember his name, and finally 2 men of the Pack and Mega varieties. Now, while the first 3 make sense from a mascot perspective, why was a Capcom and Namco icon Sony exclusives? Well, I'm sure it was befuddling to some back then and even today, but it was, like a lot of things in Cross Tekken, another way to mitigate costs. Capcom typically approaches both Sony and Microsoft early on in development with a build, a plan, and a hope that they'll get a co-marketing deal. For Street Fighter Cross Tekken, Sony was willing to offer a ton of money for co-marketing, as again, this was hot off the heels of Street Fighter IV. As with all deals like this, there were some concessions, and this one was probably bigger than most. Because they were mostly joke characters, and because it was forecast that the PS3 would have outsold the Xbox 360 version anyway, it seemed like it would have had minimal competitive impact in the end. What didn't have minimal impact was that last character in the list, Mega Man, or Bad Box Art Mega Man specifically, which was its own whole huge embarrassing separate thing. Now, this is one of those issues that was kind of no one's fault, but somehow, simultaneously still everyone's fault. Bad Box Art Mega Man, or I think he was just called Mega Man, he was a victim of timing. When the game was being developed and when he was being added to it, Mega Man was not in a bad place. Mega Man Universe had been announced, there was Mega Man Legends 3, and a third project was also in development. It was really looking like a time to celebrate Mega Man, so the team wanted to have some fun with it. And then the sequence of events happened where all 3 titles were cancelled, so it turned out to be the year of the death of Mega Man. Then they announced him for Cross Tekken, with him looking like Bad Box Art Mega Man, and without that context about when and why he was developed, it really looked like another slap in the face to Mega Man players, so again, he was a victim of timing. In fact, PR in general for Cross Tekken always seemed to run into some type of embarrassing snafu, with certain ventures, while maybe not hurting the actual game, certainly didn't help lift the already pungent miasma that had lingered since the big gem reveal. Okay, so with that, we are now reaching the 3rd strike of Cross Tekken, and as I'm sure all of you are aware,
You know what they say. The third strike is what counts. You know.
it's time to talk about OD DLC. Xbox 360 versions were leaked and split wide open and out-toppled 12 DLC characters all on the disc, all essentially finished. As to why they were finished and not included in the base package, well, they were being held back as they were initially going to be timed exclusives for the Vita port. Remember the Vita port? Well, it was scheduled to come out 6 months after the home console launch, apparently another part of the co-marketing deal with Sony. Now you can say a lot about Cross Tekken, and people have, but this was such a catastrophic PR nightmare for Capcom that it changed how they did downloadable content from then on out, especially for fighting games. With all the other very not good press surrounding it, Capcom moved up the launch of the DLC roster to July, as console warriors were furious they would have to wait 6 months to play with characters that were already on the disc that they had paid for due to a Vita version they didn't even want. Hackers would even go online with these characters, further adding insult to injury, and I can't imagine Sony was happy about all this either. This whole disaster wasn't something that took Capcom, and especially Capcom USA, by surprise, as they correctly predicted this would happen, but wouldn't you know it, their fears were waved off. Street Fighter Cross Tekken became the poster child for on-disc DLC. There was a meeting between the production team in Japan and the marketing team in the US. We had stated people are going to find the on-disc DLC because 100% of all Xbox 360 games are cracked before launch. And the response to that was, why would anyone crack the game? That's illegal! There was a long pause, a very long pause, and then the director of marketing replied back to that with a very blunt, please remove the on-disc DLC. And the response to that was, well, if we do that, we're going to have to push the game out to April or May, and we'll have to tell Mr. Sugimoto that it was marketing's decision to push it to the next fiscal year. It very well could have been true that the work needed to remove the content would have pushed them back, but basically they were saying, we need to have this released by the fiscal year, and if not, well, that's going to screw over the company, and it's going to be your fault. So that was pretty much a direct threat. We just had to lose that battle. And lose they did! Capcom's projections for Cross Tekken were 2 million units within the launch period, but by mid-May, they'd barely moved 1.4, considerably slower than the last couple of fighting games released by either Capcom or Namco. And I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here, but I haven't even gotten to the actual game part of all this yet, because many fans, especially within the FGC, weren't keen on how the moment-to-moment fighting played out. Because of the way the tag system worked, a higher than normal percentage of matches would be decided by timeout. Then there was Pandora, a heavily advertised comeback mechanic that no one wanted to come back to. And don't forget the incredibly distracting, sometimes unclear UI that just For a more in-depth breakdown of all the issues players had, I suggest StumbleBee's video on the subject, as it looks more at the minutiae of all the fighting mechanics that didn't quite work at launch. So, all these factors, coupled with Capcom's DLC $dreams being shattered, firmly planted Cross Tekken in that slippery pit with no real way to escape.
You can't escape!
What also certainly contributed to its financial failure was the competition, which was an assault that came from pretty much every angle, and somewhat ironically, came mostly from Capcom itself. Remember, the very same year Cross Tekken was announced in 2010, Capcom also revealed Marvel 3, and also launched Ultimate All-Stars, and also launched Street Fighter 4 Arcade Edition in 2011. That's 4 different fighting games trying to coexist all at the same time by the same company, and it simply wasn't viable. With that said, Capcom didn't give up entirely. Yeah, they canceled the thousands of gems they had planned and had to blow their character DLC load early, but they realized the game still had a lot of fundamental problems that they were committed to fixing. This brings us to Cross Tekken 2013 Edition, a way to let players know it was receiving an overhaul without having to spend money on new assets or features, because the last thing they wanted to do was spend more money that they weren't making. This patch addressed almost all complaints players had. Characters were rebalanced, the UI was fixed and made more clear, the tag system and gray life adjusted. For all intents and purposes, this was the game that should have been available at launch, and smartly, Capcom made this a free update. But once that update was issued, that's all she wrote for Cross Tekken. The 4 new Street Fighter characters that it introduced, Rolento, Hugo, Poison, and Elena, were then added to Ultra Street Fighter 4. So some smart asset reuse there. In the subsequent years, fans have since rallied around the game, especially on PC, what with its impressive modding scene, growing it to an obviously small but passionate fanbase.
I came here. Oh man!
This was only made possible with the positive changes seen in the 2013 update, and in terms of the core fighting game, people's views on Cross Tekken have softened because of it. Now, as for Tekken Cross Street Fighter, the Tekken-focused 3D sequel that was never officially announced and never officially cancelled, well, after the Tekken team finished Tekken 6, and then Tekken Tag Tournament 2, then Tekken 7 Arcade, then Tekken 3DS, then Tekken 7 Fated Retribution, then Tekken 7 the console version, they haven't really made any strong indication that they'll ever return to the concept. If Capcom's attempt had been a rousing success, we most likely would have seen Harada's take by now. It's odd how since this whole misfire, Capcom's fighting efforts have struggled in some form or another.
I hope my horrible ugliness won't be a distraction to you.
While Tekken 7 has emerged as one of the most popular fighters of the last few years, selling 5 million copies and still going strong. It's fairly easy to see a pattern here. Capcom tried to push out multiple fighting games, often in the same year, and often cannibalizing its own sales, while Tekken focused on one release at a time, riding out their success until they were ready to announce another. The former Capcom employee sums it up best in regards to the whole unfortunate situation. After all the gems and all the on-disc DLC, it made us say, what is going on with this game? And that sort of brought up the in-joke that it must have been greenlit over an ancient Native American burial ground because it was just cursed. And that was the other name we had for the game, which was Street Fighter Cursed Tekken, because nothing went right with it. So make no mistake, the intentions here were good. Deliver a fighting game that many weren't expecting that featured lots of over-the-top mechanics, but due to poor planning and poor budgeting and just plain old bad luck, Cross Tekken was the partner that got sacrificed for other fighting franchises to thrive. And with that, if you know of any other pugilistic punch-em-ups that had problematic perils, let me know in the comments below or cross the line over to the Flophouse VIP Patreon to nominate the subject of our next episode. See you next time, and thanks for watching.